Hey guys, tonight we sneak into a wedding hall packed to the velvet walls. The lamps flicker gently above your head, and you catch the scent of rose water, burnt sugar, and stiff starch lingering in the air. Dozens of ladies bustle past, balancing teacups on trembling saucers, while a quartet in the corner saws away at a waltz no one dares to dance to yet. You sidestep a butler carrying a tray stacked with tiny cucumber sandwiches, and that's when you see it. Not the bride, not the groom, but the cake. It looms at the far end of the ballroom, taller than any person in the room. It is tiered like a wedding cake skyscraper, climbing into the gaslight glow with sugary defiance. You count 6 levels of cake, each more ostentatiously decorated than the last. Cherubs made from marzipan perch on the edges, sugar-paste doves, entire miniature gardens, a waterfall made of spun sugar that drips silently from tier to tier. The guests murmur as they pass. One elderly woman snorts and mutters, "Should have just married the confectioner." You drift closer and overhear the whispers. The groom's family owns a shipping company. This cake was hauled in from London by train, then by carriage. It required a pulley system and 3 men to hoist it through the side window. And no, the bottom tier isn't real. It's just plaster painted to match, to make it taller. Because everything must be taller than the cousin's wedding last spring. You spot the bride at last. She's petite, barely 5 feet, with a waist so cinched she looks like she might snap if she exhales. Her eyes dart nervously toward the cake, then toward her groom, who's posing with a monocle and a brooding, serious frown that must have taken hours to rehearse in the mirror. When it's time to cut the cake, chaos ensues. The knife, which was specially engraved for the occasion, isn't long enough. A footman brings a longer knife. Someone suggests a saw. The bride's father insists the middle tier be served because the top is for display only and the bottom is hollow. Eventually a slice is pried from the 3rd tier like an archaeological artifact and handed to the bride with a lace napkin. She smiles and then immediately drops it, right on her slipper. The silence is sharp. You hold your breath. Then the groom starts laughing. And slowly, the whole room follows. The cake, magnificent and ridiculous, has broken the tension. They take turns nibbling slices, pretending it tastes better than it does. Later, you overhear someone say it was made with rice flour because it keeps longer. "They're not eating it," she whispers. "They're storing it for legacy." It's not a dessert, it's a monument. And as the last note of the waltz fades and the bride is led off to change into her going-away dress, you glance back once more at the towering cake. It's still standing, taller than her, taller than sense, and destined, perhaps, to live on. In family law, far longer than the marriage itself. You follow the trail of icing-smeared napkins and champagne droplets into the smaller drawing room, where guests now gather around what they call the cake commentary. Apparently this is a thing. You find yourself beside a pair of aunts whispering like critics at a gallery opening. One saw something like it at the Duke of Norfolk's wedding, one says. But that one had real gold leaf, the other replies smugly. This looks like bronze sugar at best. You pretend to inspect a sugar rose just to fit in. Then the bride's younger brother stumbles in, cheeks flushed, a slice of the cake sliding around on his plate. "Mum says don't eat the top tier," he announces. "It's for the first child's christening." Ah, that's right. A Victorian tradition. The couple saves the top layer of the cake, wrapped in muslin, for the baptism of their firstborn. You glance at the towering structure again and realise they have no idea how to preserve it. One cousin suggests encasing it in glass like a relic. Another says they'll bury it underground to keep it cool. Then comes the classic Victorian moment. Someone pulls out a wedding cake scrapbook. You blink. Yes, it's real. Apparently fashionable ladies clip icing decorations from the cake, flatten them between pages, and press them like flowers. Souvenirs, they say. History and sugar. You peek over a shoulder and see a preserved sugar dove next to a scrap of silk ribbon. Someone's written underneath, Wedding of Millicent Grayson, 1863. Cake dry, bride nervous. Groom went bald by 1870. Victorians really did love recording everything, even the dryness of their desserts. Then, of course, comes the edible chaos. The cake is so dense it bends forks. The icing has the chewiness of wallpaper paste. A little girl cries after biting into what she thought was chocolate but turned out to be spice, likely caraway, a common Victorian flavour that tastes like confusion and bad decisions. One man swears he found a clove large enough to start a trade war. And yet, despite the sugar fatigue, everyone is beaming. Because this isn't about flavour, it's about display, excess, appearances. One older gentleman in a tailcoat says, through a mouthful of almond paste, "My boy, they'll talk about this cake long after they've forgotten the bride's name." And he's probably right. You spot a lady trying to sketch the cake before it gets dismantled. A footman is wrapping slices in wax paper to send home with guests. Someone even asks if they can take a sugar cherub for their mantelpiece. No one says no, because in this strange, showy moment the cake has transcended dessert. It has become a symbol of wealth, of ambition, of how, in Victorian society, even your dessert had to stand up straight, wear a top hat and compete for attention. You nibble a corner of your own slice, taste like nutmeg and cold marble. But you smile anyway, because you know this. In 50 years, someone will still be telling the story of the wedding where the cake was taller than the bride, where the icing cracked like stone, and where a single sugar swan lived forever in a scrapbook. The next wedding you find yourself at feels quieter, stranger, less champagne sparkle, more whispering velvet. The drawing room is hushed, with guests arranged like wax figures around a single glowing centrepiece. The bride. She stands motionless beneath a lace-draped arch, eyes fixed forward, lips barely parted. At first, you don't notice what's odd. The air is thick with lavender and camphor, and her dress seems, well, conventional enough. White silk, full skirts, high collar, the usual Victorian elegance. But then a gleam catches your eye, not from beads, not from pearls, from something finer, hair. You lean in, just slightly, and there it is. Strands of auburn and chestnut woven delicately along the hem, stitched in intricate spirals, sewn into the lace cuffs, even coiled into the embroidered initials on the bodice. ETW, her name apparently. You feel a chill. Was this just hers? No, that would be far too simple. A bridesmaid sidles up and whispers, "She asked everyone to donate. Family, friends, even the vicar's wife sent a braid by post." You glance back at the dress with new eyes. The texture you mistook for raised embroidery, plaits of real human hair, some thick, some wispy, some a bright copper that couldn't possibly match hers. Apparently it started as a sentimental idea, a way to carry a part of everyone she loved into the marriage. But as more hair arrived in envelopes and parcels, she refused to stop. It became a collection, someone murmurs, a collection she wore. You catch sight of the groom, tall, nervous, one hand compulsively smoothing his sideburns. He hasn't touched the bride yet. Maybe he's afraid of getting tangled. The guests shift in their chairs, and you overhear a lively debate. One aunt says hair embroidery was common in Victorian mourning art. Lockets, brooches, even entire wall hangings made from the tresses of loved ones. Another insists this is not mourning, it's devotion. She turned mourning art into marriage art, she says with quiet pride. But not everyone agrees. A young cousin leans toward you and stage whispers, Mama says it's unsanitary. And truthfully, the closer you look, the more it feels like the dress might breathe. Every time she moves, the strands seem to shimmer and shift, like they have opinions. The ceremony begins. The bride glides down the aisle, and as she passes, you swear you smell beeswax and rosewater, and something sharper beneath it. Not decay, not filth, just scalp. Powdered and perfumed and woven into love. It's mesmerizing and faintly unsettling, but also deeply, oddly Victorian. Because in a world obsessed with memory, with sentiment, with keeping everything preserved, what better way to eternalize affection than by stitching your wedding dress with the literal DNA of your social circle? You glance down at your gloves, white kid leather, spotless, and suddenly they feel very boring. After the vows are spoken, her voice barely audible under the weight of the gown, the guests are led into the parlour for tea and tarts, but no one can stop talking about the dress. They murmur in clusters around the samovar, speculating about who's who in the stitches. One woman insists she spotted her own contribution in the hem, dark auburn from my school plate sent in May. Another whispers she gave hers unwillingly. It was taken from a hairbrush after an overnight visit. That can't possibly be true, can it? You sit beside the hearth, nibbling a lemon biscuit, watching as the bride attempts to sit. The dress resists. It doesn't crumple like normal fabric. The seams stiffen. The long braids along the skirt twist just enough to make her hesitate. Eventually she perches awkwardly on the edge of a carved settee like a statue on display. Someone mentions how hair jewellery was once a popular betrothal gift. A ring wound with the beloved's curl, a bracelet of fine braid. But this is architecture, not an accessory. And then the fringe detail surfaces, literally. A fringe made entirely of moustache trimmings. Yes, moustache trimmings. It's not obvious at first glance, but up close. The tassels swaying gently from the sleeves aren't silk, they're fine, bristly strands, gathered and twisted with minute care. The groom's barbershop friends had contributed as a joke, and she had the fringe added as a warning, she claimed. To remind him, she told a cousin, of what he owes me, and how quickly it can be trimmed. You choke slightly on your biscuit. The family photo is next. The bride is placed in the centre, flanked by the donors. Each of them, it seems, was asked to wear a small label indicating where on the dress their contribution was located. You spy one pinned with "Left Shoulder Vine, M. Beatrice, aged 8. Another reads, "Right cuff braid, E. Barnaby of Waltham." You can't decide whether this is heartwarming or horrifying. Then the final oddity arrives. A scrapbook. Of course, Victorian weddings are nothing if not heavily documented. But this one is not just photographs or pressed petals. It's clippings. Tiny samples of hair from each contributor, pasted next to a sketch of where it appeared on the dress. Labelled, dated, and bound in soft leather. The bride herself made it. A reference in case of repair, she says sweetly, or duplication. Should I pass it on to my daughter? There is, as you might expect, no mention of dry cleaning. By now the fire is low, and guests begin to leave, drifting out into the fog with whispers and sideways glances. One man says he'll never look at his hairbrush the same again. A governess jokes she'll start locking her comb in a drawer. As for you, you step once more past the dress, which now hangs stiffly in the entryway. On display, no longer a wedding garment, but a sculpture of community, woven with memory, sentiment, and probably dandruff. You exhale. Still not the strangest wedding you've attended, but it's climbing the list. You arrive at the next wedding in a haze of lavender cologne and varnished wood polish, ushered into a fine townhouse where the walls are lined with portraits that stare far too intently. It's the sort of affair where the champagne has already been uncorked before the guests even take their coats off. But something's off. Not in the atmosphere. It's elegant, if a little stiff. But in the way people are glancing sideways at the bride's neckline. You drift closer. Her gown, a delicate ivory satin with a modest neckline, is adorned with an impossible number of trinkets. Chains, lockets, stick pins, rings tied with ribbon. Tiny medallions rest across her collarbone, some dangling low enough to tap against her gloves when she lifts her hands. None of them match. They sparkle in competing shades of gold, silver, pewter, and every single piece, as you overhear, comes from a different unmarried man. You blink. Sorry. What? Apparently it's a tradition in this town, or maybe just in this family. Before the wedding, the bride sends a formal invitation to every bachelor in her extended social circle, not just to attend, but to contribute a token, a personal ornament, a piece of jewellery they might otherwise wear to courtship events. The result is dazzling and slightly absurd. Her bodice looks like a pawnshop exploded onto a corset. One particularly shiny chain belonged to a banker. Another is rumoured to be the type-in of an opera singer who once proposed to her on a dare. Some of the men sit now in the audience, adjusting their cuffs, pretending they don't see their former tokens bobbing on her clavicle like trophies. You spot a short man in a green waistcoat muttering, "Mine's the one near her elbow." His friend pats his shoulder solemnly. The symbolism, as one older lady confides over tea cakes, is that the bride carries the attention of many, but chooses only one. It's supposed to flatter the groom, but by the looks of it, he's having a hard time keeping a straight face, especially since one of the borrowed rings is too small to fit on her chain and has been fastened quite visibly to the back of her glove with a safety pin. The groom whispers something to the bride as they pose for a portrait. She laughs a little too loudly. You can't help but wonder if the necklace-clinking chorus is going to echo all the way through their vows. During the procession, the effect becomes even more bizarre. Every step the bride takes, her bodice tinkles. The jewellery clatters lightly like distant wind chimes, turning a solemn march into something vaguely musical. A little girl near you imitates the sound with a teaspoon and is immediately hushed. You glance toward the officiant, who clearly didn't anticipate this much hardware. He leans forward slightly, trying to speak over the jingling. The guests suppress their giggles, but barely. And when the bride says, "I do," the final note of her voice is accompanied by a sharp little plink, one chain slipping loose and falling to the floor with perfect comedic timing. The guests burst into laughter. She smiles, picks it up and tosses it to the nearest bachelor with a wink. Somehow, this is still more dignified than many weddings you've seen. After the ceremony, the guests flood into the conservatory for the reception. The bride, now loosened up from the vows and the warm applause, moves among them like a living chandelier, her borrowed ornaments catching sunlight from every direction. You watch her reach for a cup of tea and hear half a dozen chains chime against porcelain. She's radiant, yes, but there's something else. You start noticing the looks. The men whose jewellery she borrowed are hovering, each in his own way. One stands stiffly by the refreshment table, arms folded, clearly pretending he doesn't care. Another makes exaggerated jokes near the punch bowl, loud enough to be heard by her and her new husband. A third nervously checks his pocket watch, as if waiting for the precise moment he's allowed to reclaim his locket. Because that's the other part of the tradition. The bride doesn't return the jewellery until the evening's end. It's a kind of dance, really, polite, awkward, symbolic. One by one, each bachelor must come forward and accept his trinket back, along with a parting message. Sometimes a thank you, sometimes a hint. You see it begin. A young barrister approaches. She lifts the silver ring from her glove and slips it into his palm. "May your next offering be accepted in full," she says sweetly. He smiles, just a bit too wide. and backs away. Another bachelor, bolder, leans in to ask for something in return. She gives him the tiniest pressed flower from her bouquet and a raised eyebrow. No more. By the time she gets to the final piece, a weighty gold fob that once belonged to a lieutenant stationed in India, her husband is clearly over it. He's busy inspecting the cutlery. Still, the bride performs it all with grace, even as she sweats slightly under the layered burden of 40 borrowed memories. And then comes the real twist. One of the ornaments wasn't borrowed. It belonged to the groom. A small, oddly shaped brooch nestled near her collarbone. The only one with no ribbon, no clasp. You overhear her explaining, "He gave it to me years ago. I kept it hidden until today." The room stills for just a moment. Then the applause begins, polite and orchestrated. You're not sure if it's romantic or manipulative. Probably both. As the evening winds down, you find yourself next to an older gentleman with half-moon spectacles sipping brandy. "This sort of thing," he mutters, "used to be a proper competition. The bride made a choice, and the rest accepted it. Now it's all performance." You nod, though you're not sure. Because honestly, you're a little enchanted. The idea that a woman could parade through a room adorned with the affections of nearly every eligible man she's ever known and still walk away with the one she wants, that's not just pageantry, that's power. Victorian power in lace gloves and rattling chains. And as the bride finally unpins the last ring and folds it gently into a lace pouch, you catch her eye. She winks, and for just a second, you feel the weight of all the eyes in the room, not on the groom, not on the cake, but on the woman who wore her past like jewellery and refused to apologise for any of it. You step into a courtyard tent warmed by coal braziers, expecting a cosy, slightly dull wedding tea. But the atmosphere is far too lively. There's too much laughter, too many perfectly timed jokes, and every guest seems a little too prepared. Within minutes, you feel it in your bones. Something here doesn't add up. The groom greets you with a nervous smile and an unfamiliar firmness in his handshake. His cufflinks gleam like they've never seen a cuff before. The bride is radiant, yes, but stiff around the eyes. She repeats the same pleasantries with machine-like precision. And then you overhear it, near the roast beef carving station. Two ladies tittering in matching hats. "I was told to be someone from her music circle," one whispers. "I'm a cousin from Kent," the other grins, "though I've never been." Hired guests. You blink, glance around the room again, and suddenly it's obvious. The crowd is too good looking, too well dressed. There's a balance of ages that feels mathematically suspicious. The bridesmaids all walk in perfect time, despite never exchanging a glance. This wedding is part theatre. You make your way to the refreshment table where a man in an immaculately starched waistcoat offers you a glass of port and introduces himself as Major Albright, retired. You nod politely. 10 minutes later, you overhear him call himself Doctor to someone else, and to a child. "Uncle Percy." You nearly drop your port. Then the truth trickles in. This is a reputation ceremony. The couple, new money apparently, have rented not just the silverware, the horses and the peacocks. Yes, there are peacocks. But the people. From a firm in London, you're told. They provide social scaffolding. That means actors, acquaintances, even full-on invented uncles. The guests are briefed before the ceremony. They're given backstories, trained in proper responses, a whole cast of pretend society. You shake your head. Is this the future of marriage? A plump woman in green leans over and hisses, "The man I sat next to at dinner last week is now her cousin from Devon." She pauses. "He's actually a waiter from Bath." Even the gifts, you notice, have strange labels. From Lady Burnham, with affection, the Hargraves of Dorset. Names too grand, too vague. The wrappings are impeccable. You suspect some are empty. But here's the twist. No one seems upset. In fact, they're having a splendid time. The fake cousins tell better jokes. The fake aunts pinch cheeks with more flair. One little girl, coached to call the groom Uncle Basil, gives the most moving toast of the evening. She tears up halfway through, and you're still not sure if it was real. And maybe that's the point. Maybe, in a society obsessed with appearances, what matters most is how it looks. Not who was truly there. Not sincerity, but performance. You sip your port and wonder, was your invitation even meant for you? The longer you stay, the more it becomes clear. This wedding isn't about family or friends, it's about orchestration. A string quartet plays softly in the corner, and you realise one of the violinists keeps glancing at the groom. Too often, too knowingly. A planted friend, a former associate, maybe just another actor who took the role too seriously. At the foot of the main table, a silver tray is passed down, offering dainty folded cards with scripted compliments. You unfold yours. It reads, "You look simply ravishing during the ceremony, Aunt Francesca." You haven't met any Aunt Francesca. Apparently neither has the bride. You start to notice the code phrases. Wasn't it divine? I don't know what happened, but I'm paid to praise it. They're a very forward-thinking couple. They met 2 months ago and needed a story. How elegant her background must be. No one can confirm where she's from. At one point, the mother of the bride stands to speak. You listen. Her accent is inconsistent. Half Surrey, half stage-trained. Her earrings match her gloves too perfectly. Someone mutters, "She was in The Woman in White last winter." The play, not the wedding. Then there's the photograph cue. Not just of guests with the couple, but guests with each other, labelled by their assigned relationships, the McAllisters, the Pembertons. A man who claims to be the family solicitor is suddenly seen tying a toddler's shoes in the corner. You watch as a young woman hesitates before greeting the bride. She flutters her fan, uncertain. Finally she leans in and says, "Hello again, darling. It's been ages." The bride smiles back. "Of course. Remind me, were you from Paris or Geneva?" They both laugh, uncertainly. And just like that, the moment passes. No one calls it out. No one questions it. Because everyone here understands the game. Some may have shown up thinking they were real guests, only to realise they were extras. And still they stay. Because there's food, music, drama, laughter. And above all, a sense of being part of something grand. As the evening wears on, the veil between performance and truth thins. You watch a hired guest pull the groom aside for a serious talk. Another gives the bride a genuine embrace, their script long forgotten. Someone sings, unprompted, and others join in. The rented peacocks scream in the distance, because of course they do. And when the dancing starts, it's hard to tell who belongs to whom. A man in borrowed tails twirls a woman he met 30 minutes ago. Someone swaps calling cards with Lady Burnham. 2 little girls fall asleep under the dessert table drooling on lace doilies. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe this strange, glittering illusion is the real wedding. Because in the end, what is a wedding but a carefully staged promise? A story you agree to believe, again and again, with food and favours and just enough illusion to make it feel like magic. You leave with a ribbon around your wrist labelled "Dear Family Friend," and for tonight, you are. You arrive at the village hall just as the organ begins wheezing out the first bars of "God Save the Queen," though it's not entirely clear why. It's not a royal wedding. Still, the mood is grand enough. Children in stiff collars fidget on benches. Elderly men puff cigar smoke out of windows cracked open with spoons. Then the doors open, and in comes the bride. At first, all you see is fabric. Yards of ivory satin billow through the archway, swallowing sunlight and scattering petals as it moves. The bride is somewhere within, though she looks less like a person and more like a sailing vessel at full wind. She's wearing the largest hoop skirt you've ever seen. No, not large, weaponized. It creaks and sways with the weight of history and ambition. The steel crinoline underneath groans with each step, turning corners like a carriage, not a woman. Her petticoats rustle like sails. A small boy steps too close and gets gently bumped into a pot of stewed quinces. You glance at the groom. He's already inching toward the side aisle, calculating escape routes. The Victorian hoop skirt had reached peak absurdity by the 1860s, when width was more fashionable than logic. You recall reading somewhere that women in Paris had trouble entering cafes. In one London report, a bride tried to sit for dinner, and instead knocked over 2 entire roast ducks and a bishop. This bride? She's about to start her own legend. As she processes down the aisle, disaster strikes. A trailing ribbon catches on a pew. The skirt yanks. A candelabra teeters. The bridesmaids shriek in harmony as a gust of air sends lace veils fluttering into someone's lemonade. One old man drops his hymn book, which lands with a thud right inside the curve of the crinoline, like a hoop catching a coin at a fair. Aunt Matilda declares it divine. Then comes the staircase. The village hall has 3 stone steps up to the dais, and no one thought to check whether the skirt could fit. The bride stops, shuffles. The skirt doesn't move. 2 ushers attempt to lift the front of it like a picnic blanket, but the bride's modesty shrieks louder than her voice. Eventually someone lays down a carpeted board like a bridge, and she sails up as if being presented at the court of Neptune. The ceremony begins with the vicar sweating bullets, glancing nervously at the bride's enormous circumference. There's barely enough room for him to stand between her and the groom. Every time she breathes, the skirt shifts and squeaks. You imagine the steel coils inside slowly unravelling, like the rigging of a ship about to capsize. Still, the vows are said. Rings exchanged. The groom wipes his brow. You're half convinced he's more relieved the skirt didn't collapse than that the marriage actually happened. As the crowd applauds, the bride curtsies. Bad idea. The entire skirt ripples like a jelly mould in a carriage accident. One of the cherubic flower girls is nearly swept into the baptismal font, and yet, through it all, the bride smiles, triumphant. Because the wider the dress, the higher the status. The harder to move, the harder to reach. This is fashion's fortress, and she wears it like armour. After the ceremony, the guests pour outside into the crisp garden air, eager for jam tarts and lemonade. But the bride's skirt won't fit through the narrow doorway. Truly, it won't. A footman suggests turning sideways. That fails spectacularly. Now she's wedged. Another guest tries lifting the back like a tent flap, revealing an entire ecosystem of lace, tulle and emergency hemstitches. A third, more practically minded, removes the door from its hinges. Everyone cheers. When she finally emerges, blinking in the sunlight, hair slightly askew, her skirt lets out a boing as if relieved to be outdoors. Birds scatter, children laugh. And somewhere near the hedgerow, a woman faints from admiration or lack of oxygen. Hard to say. The skirt, having survived stairs and doorways, now faces its greatest foe, the lawn. You see it come in before she does. The perfectly manicured grass slightly damp from morning dew, soft as sponge cake. She takes one step and sinks. Just slightly, but enough. The hoop trap's air bulges oddly, and then, like a moon bounce gone rogue, lifts. Not high, just a little. Enough to send the bride wobbling with a look that says, "I will not fall in front of my in-laws." You stifle a giggle, so does the groom. They make it to the refreshment table, where another hazard awaits, folding chairs. Aunt Beatrice insists the bride sit. "For a portrait," she coos, adjusting her brooch, "and perhaps a biscuit." But here's the problem. Victorian folding chairs weren't built for hoop skirts, not even close. When she attempts to sit, the skirt springs forward, bending the chair legs until they look like a clock melting. She perches instead, floating several inches above the seat, balancing delicately like a stork in a basket. Meanwhile, the photographer arrives. He's lugging a massive wooden camera that looks like it should be printing banknotes, not portraits. He sets up the tripod, adjusts the brass lens, and announces with grave solemnity that the bride must stay absolutely still for 15 seconds. 15 seconds of motionless poise in a 20-pound steel cage. Her smile tightens. A bead of sweat rolls down her temple. One of the petticoats shifts ominously, and just as the shutter clicks, a gust of wind catches the edge of the skirt, lifting it, twisting it, sending it spinning like a carousel horse. The photo, a blur of satin and alarm. Still she laughs. The kind of laugh that echoes into the marrow of the day, because by now she knows this isn't a fashion disaster, this is legend. Guests are already composing letters about it. Children will imitate it with bedsheets for years. The skirt has eclipsed the flowers, the vows, even the cake. And just when you think it's over, one final moment. The bride stands near the gift table, receiving congratulations. A toddler toddles too close, disappears briefly beneath the hem, and re-emerges holding a sugared almond and looking triumphant. The bride winks. "Built-in nursery," she says. You walk away grinning, the echo of crinoline still ringing in your ears. Because that day, you didn't just witness a wedding. You witnessed the majestic, chaotic rise and fall of the skirt. You're led into a stately manor house this time, somewhere just outside Bath, with hedges trimmed like chess pieces and gravel that crunches with alarming precision under your shoes. Everything smells faintly of lemon oil, cigar ash, and just a whiff of boiled ham. A butler takes your coat with the grace of a man who's been polishing silver spoons since birth. The wedding is in the drawing room, you're told, so you go, and that's when you notice it. The curtains, the carpet, the furniture, the wallpaper, all in the same pattern. Pale green with gold leaf roses and winding vines. The cushions match the drapes. The tassels on the armchairs match the fringe on the lampshades. Even the tea napkins have been hand-embroidered to coordinate. You think, surely not. Then the bride enters, and your jaw hits the parquet floor. Her gown is identical. The same green and gold brocade. The same tiny repeating vine motif. Even her veil has been trimmed in the same fringe used on the footstools. She doesn't so much walk into the room as vanish into it. For a brief, terrifying moment, you lose her entirely. One of the bridesmaids gasps. Someone mutters, "She's gone camouflaged." Then she shifts, and there she is again, eyes glinting beneath the lace, lips tightly set like a general preparing for war. Apparently the dress was commissioned specially to match the family's drawing room suite. A local upholsterer, well known for his work in horsehair and needlepoint, was enlisted to create an exact replica of the parlour's decor in gown form. Why? Because this is the house she's marrying into. This room, you're told, is where generations of brides have been presented. And this bride, she didn't just want to be presented, she wanted to become part of it. She's not marrying a man, she's marrying the furniture. As the officiant begins, you glance over at the groom. He seems nervous, possibly because his bride currently blends in better than the footstool behind her. A footstool that, you now notice, is dangerously close to being mistaken for her train. The ceremony proceeds as expected. Vows, rings, a few tears, but when they say, "You may kiss the bride," the groom has to pause. He's unsure where her face begins. A ripple of stifled laughter passes through the guests. He adjusts, leans in, kisses a cheek, possibly hers. Afterward, guests mill about, trying to compliment her dress without sounding like they're describing a curtain rod. "It's so cohesive," someone offers. "She looks like home," says another, and you honestly can't tell if that's romantic or unnerving. Once the formalities are over, guests filter into the next room for the reception, only to realise it's the same room. The bride hasn't just blended into her surroundings, she's claimed them as her own. There are no seat markers, no need. Everyone instinctively avoids the chairs that match her too closely. You overhear a guest mutter, "I think I just sat on her cousin." They hadn't, but they weren't entirely wrong either. At the refreshments table, the cake appears, topped with sugared ivy leaves that match the vine motif on her skirt. Even the napkins are embroidered with golden roses. You pick one up and glance down at your own sleeves, suddenly aware that you do not belong here. You're a stranger in a family fabric portrait. But for the bride, this is triumph. She glides between the guests like a moving chaise longue, her train sweeping quietly over the parquet. The hem has a soft brushing sound, like a duster on a polished piano. One elderly aunt actually places her teacup on the end of it by accident. The bride doesn't flinch. She's already part of the furniture after all. Then comes the portrait sitting. A full photographic session is arranged in the centre of the drawing room, but the bride keeps disappearing into the background. The photographer adjusts his lens, changes the angle, switches the plates. Still, she merges seamlessly with the settee behind her. Finally, they drape her in a faintly pink shawl, borrowed from the housemaid, just so she doesn't vanish entirely. "It's like photographing a ghost," the man mutters, wiping sweat from his brow. The guests adore it. They call it avant-garde, bold, a declaration of harmony. But a few whisper that it's just strange, that dressing as the house feels a bit too permanent, like she's submitting, not celebrating, becoming part of the woodwork. You hear an older woman lean toward a young niece and whisper, "Mark my words, she'll have herself reupholstered before she lets go of that drawing room." Yet the bride beams. To her, this is not submission, it's strategy. She has entered a household that prides itself on tradition, preservation, and the unchanging beauty of its parlour. By aligning herself with it, she has claimed the highest place in its hierarchy, not as a guest, not even as a wife, but as a fixture. And in a Victorian world where status was tied to what you could preserve, your linens, your letters, your lineage, what better way to declare permanence than to literally dress like the room you plan to rule? As the evening winds down, she sits regally, back straight, hands folded, expression neutral. Guests begin to whisper their farewells, unsure if they're addressing the bride or simply admiring the craftsmanship on the love seat. You, however, see her clearly now, not a girl lost in fabric, but a woman who understood the assignment. You step through the grand arch of the reception hall expecting the usual Victorian spread: buttered cucumbers, jellied meats, and an alarming number of eggs disguised as something else. But as you glance around, something feels different. The table settings are impeccable. Doilies folded with military precision, each name card written in a looping copper plate hand. Even the flower arrangements seem meticulously symmetrical. And then someone mentions it. "Prepared by the inmates," a guest whispers beside you, popping a sugared almond into his mouth. You pause. "I'm sorry, what?" He swallows. "The kitchen, all staffed by the local asylum. It's part of their therapeutic program." You look down at your plate. A delicate triangle of sandwich rests beside a gleaming spoon. You suddenly feel less hungry. The bride, it turns out, is the daughter of a prominent physician, one who runs a nearby rest home for what the papers politely call nervous conditions. But unlike most, he's pioneered something new: culinary rehabilitation. According to the tiny printed pamphlet resting by the water jug, this entire wedding meal, every course, has been planned, prepared, plated, and served by the convalescing minds of Belmore House, a small orchestra of cured melancholics, mild hysterics, and quiet eccentrics. One guest chuckles and whispers, "I dare say the goose aspic may contain 2 layers of emotion." You nod, not entirely reassured. The first course is brought in by a young man in spotless white, eyes unfocused, humming a baroque tune as he balances 3 tureens. Another follows, beaming proudly, whispering to himself, "They said I'd never handle hot liquids again." The food is surprisingly magnificent. The fish is poached to perfection. The vegetables are cut into identical crescents. There's a veal jelly moulded into the shape of an open book, and the bread, still warm with butter pats shaped like tiny doves. Guests murmur approval. One woman declares it the most thoughtful wedding meal she's ever attended. "A bit mad," someone says cheerfully, "but rather brilliant, really." But then the pudding comes out, and it's purple, bright purple. The consistency is questionable, the texture rubbery. You scoop a small portion onto your plate and watch it quiver with quiet menace. A footman leans over and explains helpfully, "It's plum, parsnip and laudanum." You raise an eyebrow. He grins. "Kidding?" You're not sure. The groom looks mildly concerned. The bride, however, glows with pride. She rises to make a toast. "Let this day be a celebration not only of love," she says, "but of renewal, of the brilliance that lives in every mind no matter how it wanders." There is soft, polite applause. One of the kitchen staff beams and waves, cradling a plate of devilled eggs like it's a newborn. And somehow, despite the nerves, despite the confusion over whether your aspic might be whispering to you, you begin to relax. Because it's odd, yes, eccentric, perhaps even mildly inappropriate by high society standards. But it's also human. It's a wedding made not to impress, but to include. Even those most often left outside the hall, the evening meal winds down with the gentle clinking of spoons on porcelain and the occasional puzzled cough when someone bites into a canapé containing, quite possibly, lavender and pickled beetroot. No one is sure, and no one wants to ask. The staff, the convalescing cooks, are now standing in a neat line near the wall, dressed in clean linen aprons, their expressions a mix of pride and restraint. Some sway slightly with exhaustion. One man nervously rearranges a tray of uneaten scones by colour, muttering, "They shouldn't touch. Not red beside yellow. No, no." A guest tries to hand him a tip. He refuses. "We are part of the experience," he says with quiet dignity. And truly they are. The groom clinks his glass and begins a toast. It's sweet, if a bit rehearsed. He thanks the bride's father for his vision, and the staff of Belmore House for their flavours and their fortitude. Then he adds, perhaps unadvisedly, and for reminding us that no mind is beyond repair, not even mine after this week. A few nervous chuckles. Someone snorts wine through their nose. As the toasts finish, a young girl begins distributing tiny recipe booklets as favours. Handwritten, unevenly stapled, filled with scratchy illustrations and indecipherable measurements. One page reads, "To make the jelly calm, whisper to it kindly and never stir widdershins." Another, "Cake rises best when kissed by morning fog." Someone leans in and whispers, "They're mad." Another corrects gently, "They're poets." Soon the guests are ushered outside for the final surprise. In the garden, beneath a trellis of night-blooming jasmine, a modest cake is wheeled out. 3 tiers, slightly leaning, but stunning in its decoration. The icing spells out, in shimmering sugar script, "Baked with grace by Belmore hands." A hush falls over the group. Then a man in a crooked bow tie steps forward, slicing the cake with solemn care. The first piece is served to the bride's father, who smiles and tears up in one motion. The second to the woman who carved the roses from candied beetroot. The third to the quiet young man who stirred the frosting for hours, humming a single note the entire time. The bride cuts the next one. She lifts it with steady hands, offers it to her new husband and says, "It's sweeter than sanity." And he replies, without a trace of irony, "Then I'll take two." By now the sky has darkened. The scent of blooming jasmine mixes with a faint hint of nutmeg and overcooked custard. Laughter drifts across the lawn like candle smoke. Someone plays a waltz on a cracked violin, and you realise the oddity of this wedding doesn't lie in the food or the cooks. It lies in its refusal to pretend, in its embrace of imperfection, in its quiet insistence that joy can come from the hands of those the world has underestimated. You chew slowly, letting the last bite melt on your tongue. It's delicious, even if you're still not sure what's in it. You're halfway through your second cup of tea, nibbling on a jam tart that's falling apart in your fingers, when a footman rushes in, flushed, panting, and holding nothing. He leans into the groom's ear and whispers frantically. The groom blinks, then slowly turns toward the bride's father, seated calmly near the hearth, cradling a snifter of brandy. "Where is it?" the groom says through clenched teeth. The older man looks up, blinking mildly. "Where's what?" "You already know what's coming. The marriage license is missing. Not delayed, not smudged. Gone." The bride's father, a former naval officer and current amateur geologist, had insisted on personally delivering the license from town that morning. A father's duty, he declared, like walking her down the aisle, only with paperwork. But somewhere along the country road, in a moment of distraction or stubborn pride, he pulled the carriage to a stop near a muddy embankment to examine what he thought might be a fossilized turnip. You're not sure whether to laugh or scream. The groom is now pacing near the windows, muttering about annulments. The bride has removed one glove and is slowly, methodically twisting it into knots. Within minutes, a search party is assembled. You, yes, you, are handed a lantern and instructed to follow the east hedgerow. Others are dispatched toward the ditches flanking the carriage path. An uncle in patent leather boots stomps off muttering about bureaucratic quicksand. The sun is sinking fast and the damp chill of a late autumn evening begins to creep into your sleeves. You crunch along the gravel, eyes scanning for anything parchment-coloured. Then someone shouts. It's the bride's father. He's knee-deep in mud, one foot stuck under a collapsed fence post, triumphantly waving a bundle of soggy papers above his head. "I found it," he roars, "under a hedgehog nest." The cheering is tentative. You race back with the others to inspect the damage. The license, though speckled with mud and twigs, appears, miraculously, intact. The ink is smudged. One signature is now partially illegible. There's a feather stuck to the corner that no one can explain. Still, the officiant takes it with a weary sigh and lays it carefully between two warming bricks, like a goose sandwich from a Dickensian picnic. While everyone waits for it to dry, the guests are encouraged to improvise. A barrel is rolled into the garden and lit from within, a bonfire of sorts. Potatoes are handed out for roasting. A few clever children make dolls from twigs and leftover ribbons. Someone pulls out a concertina and starts playing folk tunes at increasingly frantic speed. And you sit by the fire with the bride's grandmother, who offers you a toasted walnut and says, "This is the most fun I've had since 1829. Eventually the license is pronounced functionally dry. It bears the faint imprint of the hedgehog nest and a single unmistakable paw print, but it's valid. Barely. The ceremony resumes. The bride is radiant again, cheeks flushed from firelight and frustration. The groom looks like a man who's just wrestled a bear and won, and the bride's father. He grins through the entire thing, mud on his cuffs, a fossil clutched in one hand. Best kind of wedding, he says later, is one that almost didn't happen. The moment the vows are finally completed, license now thoroughly smoked, soggy but legal, the crowd lets out a cheer so sincere it feels like someone just scored a goal at a cricket match. Even the officiant smiles, holding up the damp paper like a victorious parchment scroll. Someone tosses confetti, someone else tosses a half-roasted potato. You glance at the bride's shoes, now delicately singed at the toe from standing too close to the bonfire. She doesn't seem to mind. She's laughing, finally relaxed, her gown trailing ashen ribbon like a battlefield banner. But then a new challenge presents itself. The official wedding register, the elegant red-bound book used for signing names and dates with fine penmanship, is nowhere to be found. The parlour where it had been kept, locked. The key, lost. Possibly in the same ditch as the licence. No one panics this time. They're all well beyond panic. Instead, someone finds a blank guest book, the kind used for memories and optional verses. The officiant flips to a fresh page, draws a line with a butter knife dipped in ink and solemnly declares, "Improvised legality." The bride signs first, her letters looping grandly, only slightly crooked from residual adrenaline. The groom follows, careful and deliberate, his signature catching on a breadcrumb left behind by a child who'd been drawing smiley faces in the margins earlier. The bride's father insists on signing last, as a kind of bookend to his earlier mishap. He pulls out his fountain pen, still crusted with mud, and scribbles his name with such flourish it takes up nearly half the page. "Consider it a watermark," he says proudly. Once the last name is inked in, a spontaneous reception erupts across the garden. Someone passes around mugs of spiced cider. The wedding cake, which had been quietly melting on a table under the weight of its own marzipan roses, is finely cut, slightly tilted, but still standing. You watch as slices are distributed on whatever plates can be found. Saucers, napkins, even a few flattened tin pie lids. The bride offers you a piece herself, her gloves long abandoned, a smudge of soot on her cheek. "Sorry about the potatoes," she says. "We hadn't planned on firewood cuisine." You laugh. It might be the best wedding I've ever attended. And you mean it, because there's something oddly perfect in the imperfection of it all. The missed steps, the lost items, the footnote about a hedgehog nest and an improvised guest book. It's as if the chaos pulled everyone closer together, like the day chose its own character and everyone just followed. Later that evening, when the music starts, played by a band that was meant to perform inside but instead dragged their instruments out into the garden, you dance alongside guests with muddy boots and rumpled cravats. Even the grandmother joins in, waving her cane like a metronome. The bride and groom sway beside the bonfire, tired but glowing, and when someone hands the bride her singed veil from earlier, she just ties it around her waist and keeps dancing, because in the end this wasn't the wedding they planned. It was better. It was theirs. The ceremony's over. The toasts have been made. The elder cousins are loosening their collars, and someone has already fallen asleep behind the potted fern. You make your way into the long portrait gallery, where the bride has organised a group photograph. One of those Victorian full-body compositions where no one is allowed to blink for 15 seconds. The photographer is barking directions from behind a curtain. Taller people to the back, hands visible, no smiling. This is for history. You're directed to stand near the centre, beside a young bridesmaid in a pale floral dress. She's maybe 17, quiet, clutches a lace parasol like it might float her away. Then the moment comes. The plate is loaded, the camera clicks, and just like that, it's over. Except, When the photo is developed later, she's not in it. At all. Everyone else is there, frozen in grayscale dignity. But where she stood, only wallpaper. The guests gather around the print in confusion. Someone taps the image with a gloved finger. There, where the rose trellis curls, they say. That's where she was. But it's just floral pattern, seamless, continuous. The exact same print as her dress. She had vanished, visually absorbed by the decor. A great-uncle with monocle experience declares it a phenomenon of chromatic congruity, while a governess whispers that it might be a warning from the aesthetic world. The bride is both mortified and delighted. It's as if the house chose to keep her, she says. The bridesmaid herself, when found an hour later near the conservatory doors, seems unaware anything happened at all. I stepped aside to breathe, she says, blinking. Did I miss the photo? No one quite knows what to tell her. It turns out the wallpaper, cream and rose-patterned with delicate ivy, was hand-printed in Paris. A recent addition to the manor, matched precisely by the bride's mother to the new upholstery and, as it turns out, the bridesmaid gowns. The dresses had been custom-made, meant to evoke the walls without disappearing into them. Apparently someone miscalculated. The guests begin calling her Camellia, after the flower she now seems indistinguishable from. She takes it in stride, though she does start carrying a fan with a gold handle, just to give herself an outline. By the time the second group photo is attempted, she's been relocated to stand in front of a window. For contrast, the photographer says through gritted teeth. The photo is taken again. She appears this time, barely. But the legend is born. For the rest of the evening, guests tell newcomers, "You missed it, the girl who vanished into the wall." It spreads like a storybook rumour. People begin posing beside her deliberately, as if standing next to her might bring luck. A few children try to blend into the curtains, hoping to disappear as well. One guest, half drunk on elderflower cordial, kneels beside the skirting board and whispers, "Reveal yourself, wallpaper maiden." The bridesmaid curtsies politely and eats another shortbread biscuit. She's now famous, and the bride. She's already planning to have the photograph framed, with the empty patch where her cousin once stood labelled Eliza, somewhere in bloom. Later in the evening, as the moon hangs low over the lawn, and the string quartet launches into a haunting rendition of Greensleeves, the bridesmaid, Eliza, now nicknamed the Wallflower Queen, has become the unofficial highlight of the wedding. Children flock to her as if she were part ghost, part celebrity. One bolder little boy asks if she can disappear again. "Only if the pattern permits it," she replies, holding up the corner of her hem with mysterious flair. Another child insists she try blending into the curtains this time. She obliges. It works. The guests start whispering theories. "She's done it before," someone mutters. "I heard she once vanished into a bookshelf." "No, no," counters another. "It's the fabric, that Parisian cotton. You know the French, always meddling with perception." One older gentleman with excellent sideburns swears the pattern isn't just a match, it's alive. "It wanted her," he says gravely, as if this were a séance. Even the bride gets in on the fun. She poses with Eliza near the original wall, pretending to search for her cousin while dramatically calling her name. "Eliza, dear, if you can hear me, blink twice." Click. The photographer captures the moment. It's chaos, yes, but also kind of beautiful. The reception meal resumes, and Eliza is seated, on purpose, between two extremely patterned armchairs, causing at least one vicar to momentarily lose her during the soup course. You overhear him mutter, "She's gone again," before realising she's simply dipped behind a fern. Aunt Millicent, the family matriarch, is unimpressed. "In my day," she declares, "we wore sensible greys and never risked blending into anything." but the younger guests adore Eliza. Her unexpected vanishing act has transformed what might have been a stiff society wedding into something memorable, odd, and strangely joyful. By the time the dancing begins, someone has gifted her a floral sash in navy blue. So the humans can track you, the card says. She twirls gracefully across the floor, spinning just fast enough to blur but not quite vanish. And as she curtsies to her final partner, applause breaks out. Not for the dance, but for the girl who briefly became part of the architecture. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's what makes this wedding so unforgettable. Not the cake, not the speeches, not even the bride's exquisite veil made of imported Belgian netting. No, what people will remember is the bridesmaid who vanished into the wallpaper and came back with a smile. A reminder, perhaps, that even in the stiffest traditions of the Victorian era, sometimes the magic sneaks in, not through the flowers or the vows or the silver spoons, but through one quiet girl in a dress that dared to match the room. By the time you arrive, the air already smells like wet wool, overturned earth, and strong opinions about weather. A grey sky hangs low over the fields, and guests shuffle in beneath a canopy of umbrellas that groan with the weight of rainwater pooling in their folds. You were told this was meant to be an outdoor affair, a garden ceremony no less. Roses, trellises, doves in tiny cages. But Mother Nature had other plans. Victorian England, after all, was no stranger to a sky that turned traitor with only a moment's notice. Still, the event trudges on. Chairs have been relocated to a makeshift marquee. Patched canvas held up by optimism and a few wooden poles. The ground beneath your feet squelches ominously, threatening to steal your boots with every step. A young boy sinks slightly and is tugged free by a governess who hisses, "Heel first, darling, never toe!" And then you see the bride. She's not gliding, she's splashing. Each step she takes sends a gentle ripple across the puddles. Her gown, an ivory silk with too many layers for its own good, is gathered at the waist and bundled under her arms like laundry on wash day. But what draws every eye isn't the soaked hem or the frizzed curls, it's the galoshes. Sturdy, rubber-soled, jet black. The kind of footwear you'd expect on a gardener, not a bride. But she wears them proudly, paired with lace gloves and a determined grin. Someone gasps, someone else applauds. Apparently she came prepared. They were a gift, she explains to a cluster of guests sheltering under a pear tree, from my grandfather. He said if I insisted on marrying in a field, I'd better dress for the consequences. You admire that. Practicality wrapped in defiance. The groom, for his part, is not faring nearly as well. His shoes, soft leather, freshly polished, are now a squelching disaster. His socks, once pristine, peak sadly above his soaked ankles. At one point he tries to tiptoe across a particularly muddy patch and nearly loses a shoe to the earth's hunger. The officiant arrives late, drenched, spectacles fogged. The marriage licence, damp but legible, is unfurled with 2 flat irons. The couple stands together under a crooked tent pole, water dripping steadily into a soup tureen behind them, and still they smile. Because there's something strangely delightful in all of it. The way the rain has washed away pretension. The way the guests, huddled close under mismatched umbrellas, suddenly feel like family. The way the bride's galoshes squeak slightly every time she shifts her weight. During the vows, a breeze lifts the canvas flap and sends a fine mist over the front row. They all laugh. The bride does not flinch. She simply plants her feet more firmly, galoshes gripping the earth like anchors. And when it's time to kiss, he dips her slightly, just enough for a splash to arc dramatically into the air. After the kiss, equal parts romantic and damp, the newlyweds wade arm in arm toward the reception tent, which now resembles more of a shipwreck tea party than any formal gathering. The path between the ceremony and the feast was once a gravel walkway. Now it's a thick, reluctant bog, swallowing heels and decorum alike. You watch as one poor bridesmaid, wrapped in a chiffon nightmare, is carried across by a stable boy with shoulders too broad and a sense of timing too perfect. The bride, however, walks herself. Galoshes squelching, veil soaked, hemline permanently changed by the land, and she's radiant. Inside the tent, guests do their best to pretend nothing is wrong. Chairs are hastily dried with borrowed handkerchiefs. Cloaks are hung from candelabras. A roaring fire made of damp branches hisses stubbornly in one corner, more smoke than heat. You find your place at a table already tilting slightly downhill. Water pools beneath it. No one complains. The bride's father attempts a toast, but his notes are soggy. He holds up a paper that resembles a wilted cabbage leaf and says, "I was going to speak of endurance, and now I rather think I'll just demonstrate it." Cheers erupt. Glasses clink. Someone somewhere has lost both their left shoe and their patience. Then the cake is brought out. Or rather, what's left of it. Originally designed as a multi-tiered masterpiece with sugar roses and piped poetry, it has suffered slightly from the weather. The icing now resembles peeling wallpaper, and the top tier has developed a lean not unlike the Tower of Pisa. The bride laughs. At least it didn't sink. A groomsman brandishes a dessert fork like a sword and cries, "For queen and confection," before taking the first bite. It's mostly marzipan. It mostly holds together. The real entertainment, however, is the dancing. Someone clears a space on the only patch of semi-dry ground, a wooden platform laid hastily over several stacked crates and old pews. A string trio, somewhat damp but game, begins a jaunty tune. The bride kicks off the dance in her galoshes. She lifts her skirt slightly and stomps a joyful, squishy reel across the platform, water droplets flying in every direction. The guests roar with laughter. The groom joins in, slipping once but recovering with a dramatic flourish. They whirl and wobble like a pair of weatherproof dervishes. Soon everyone is joining in, galoshes, boots, barefoot cousins with trousers rolled up to the knees. You find yourself drawn in too. By now, no one cares about etiquette. The tea is muddy. The tablecloths have collapsed. One of the centerpieces has floated gently into the side of the tent like a floral ghost ship. And yet, it's perfect. Because no amount of planning could have created this kind of joy. This strange camaraderie born of ruined hair and soaked sleeves. This wet, wild, real kind of celebration. You glance at the bride one last time, mud up to her knees, hair escaping its pins, face aglow. "I told him I wanted adventure," she says to no one in particular. I suppose this counts, and it does. For when the years pass and the guests grow older, they may forget the vows, the icing, even the names, but they will remember the bride in the galoshes, the one who stomped through the mud, kissed in the rain, and danced without waiting for the floor to dry. You arrive early, expecting a tidy countryside wedding. Modest hall, lace bunting, warm punch. Everything looks as promised. Roses tied in ribbon, hymn books neatly stacked, even the organist doing a quiet run-through of Jesu, joy of man's desiring. The guests filter in with the usual rustling silk and cough-dampened greetings. A gentle buzz of excitement fills the air, but then, an audible gasp from the back. You turn. The groom has arrived, only not entirely. From the waist up he is immaculate. Tailcoat freshly pressed, boutonniere perfectly pinned, collar stiff with just the right hint of starch. His hair is combed, his beard neatly oiled, and his gloves, pure kid leather, white as milk. But from the waist down, trousers, missing. Well, not entirely missing. He's wearing something. Brown linen underdrawers perhaps tucked into tall riding socks, boots scuffed from a hasty trot. A bit of hay clings to his shin. You blink. So does everyone else. The bride's mother fans herself with increasing speed. An aunt whispers something about a fever dream. The vicar tightens his jaw and mumbles, "We'll wait a moment." The groom, meanwhile, seems entirely unfazed. "I've had a morning," he says simply, then calmly accepts a cup of lukewarm tea. Apparently he'd set out from his lodgings by carriage, but halfway to the chapel a wheel gave out. Rather than risk being late, he leapt out and commandeered a farmer's mare. In the process, his formal trousers, borrowed, starched, and apparently stitched with far too much optimism, caught on the saddle horn and tore nearly in two. The decision was made. Ditch the trousers, keep the dignity. It's working. Barely. The bride, waiting upstairs and unaware, sends word asking why the ceremony's delayed. A maid hesitates to answer. "There's a situation," she finally manages. One of the groomsmen rushes off to find a tailor. Another suggests simply borrowing a pair from a taller usher. Someone else volunteers to sew him into a curtain. But the groom waves them all away. "I've made it this far," he says, sipping his tea, "and I rather think it's become a statement." You begin to suspect he may be enjoying this. A footman tries pinning a decorative runner from the gift table around his waist. The bride's younger brother suggests turning the tablecloth into a kilt. Nothing quite works. The vicar takes a seat with a sigh and mutters, "The Lord did say, 'Come as you are,' but I doubt he meant this literally." Eventually someone finds a forgotten garment bag, misdelivered to the kitchen of all places, and inside a spare pair of trousers, not quite the same shade and slightly too short, but dry, intact, and profoundly welcome. The groom changes behind a coat rack with the dignity of a man dressing for battle. When he re-emerges, the crowd actually cheers, and then, only then, does the ceremony begin. The bride walks down the aisle, none the wiser, until she reaches the altar, looks her groom up and down, and lifts an eyebrow ever so slightly at the unfamiliar trousers. A half-smile tugs at the corner of her mouth. No words are exchanged. None are needed. She knows something happened. He knows she knows. And both silently agree not to ruin it with an explanation. The ceremony proceeds with surprising grace. The groom, now properly trousered but slightly uneven in tone, charcoal above, ash brown below, stands tall and composed. His vows are confident, his hand steady. Though he does glance down once, as if to double-check that everything's still securely buttoned. During the exchange of rings, the bride leans in and whispers something. He stifles a laugh. You catch only two words. Tablecloth breeches. The congregation remains perfectly solemn, save for the occasional stifled giggle from the back rows. Aunt Isabel, who hadn't heard about the incident in time, is still muttering about modern tailoring scandals. The vicar hurries through the final blessing with the urgency of a man who's witnessed too many unconventional unions in his career. At the reception, the story spreads like spilled punch. Every version is slightly different. Some claim he arrived on foot, clutching half a curtain and a rooster. Others say he rode in bare-legged like a Highlander on parade. One bold cousin insists he made the trousers himself from potato sacks and resolve. The truth, of course, doesn't matter anymore. It's already become wedding law. And the groom? He embraces it. During the first dance, he twirls the bride dramatically, then poses with one foot raised, showing off the mismatched cuffs for the whole tent. The crowd erupts. By the end of the night, someone's written a ballad. Yes, a ballad. The fiddler sings it between dances, backed by accordion and drum. The groom with half a tux, who gave 0 regrets. It's terrible. It's wonderful. It's repeated for the next 2 hours. You find yourself seated beside the bride's grandmother, who chuckles softly and says, "That man's trousers will be remembered long after their golden anniversary." And she's probably right. Because weddings, especially Victorian ones, love a bit of disorder tucked beneath the corsetry. They cling to stories. They thrive on human flaws. And this story of mud, improvisation, and accidental breaches will be told every time a new generation of this family reaches for a buttonhole flower. As the newlyweds disappear into the evening mist, you spot the original torn trousers, now pinned to the garden hedge with a handwritten sign, "In case of emergency, wear with confidence." Perfect. This one was always going to be a spectacle. 3 sisters, all of marriageable age, all engaged within the same 6 months, had decided, well, their parents had decided, that it would be efficient, tasteful, and very Victorian to marry them all at once. One ceremony, one reception, one long, very precisely written notice in the Times. What could go wrong? You arrive at the church and are immediately handed a programme thicker than a railway timetable. Pages of names, hymns, order of procession, family crests, dress descriptions, even assigned handkerchief codes for each bridesmaid. It's organised within an inch of its life. 3 grooms, 3 brides, 3 sets of everything. You feel like you've walked into a wedding that has swallowed itself. The brides are indistinguishable at a glance. All 3 wear ivory lace with nearly identical veils. The youngest has a slightly pink sash, but it's lost quickly in the ocean of tulle. The grooms, to be fair, also look uncannily alike, moustached, gloved, and wearing 3-piece suits tailored by the same Savile Row man. The guests are already murmuring. Which one is Clara? No, that's Eleanor. Wait, is that the one who nearly ran off with the piano tuner? Nobody's quite sure. The ceremony begins. The vicar is determined. His voice booms like thunder in the nave. He moves through the triple vows like a man delivering railway announcements. Do you, Harold Edward Charles, take Clara Beatrice? Do you, Benjamin Wardlow Smith, take Eleanor Anne? Do you, Arthur George, take Louise Margaret? The problem is, no one is listening closely enough. Not the guests, not even the couples. Because by the time the moment comes, the great cinematic moment, the part where each couple is to seal their vows with a kiss, things go sideways. It happens in a blink. Bride 1 turns to groom 2. Bride 3 hesitates and reaches for groom 1. Groom 2, flustered, kisses bride 3 square on the cheek. Bride 2 ends up kissing her own sister's hand. Somewhere, groom 3 blinks, misses his cue entirely and kisses no one. There's a pause, a shuffling, a stifled gasp from the back, then laughter, starting small, then rolling through the pews like thunder. Even the vicar exhales and mutters, "Well, I suppose it's legal as long as they signed something." The brides, bless them, recover with grace. They loop arms and curtsy in unison like ballerinas at curtain call. The grooms stand beside the wrong women for the official portrait. No one corrects them, not yet, because by now the error has become the story. You glance at the printed programmes, the ink is smudged, the handkerchief codes are forgotten, someone's labelled a bouquet incorrectly and given lilies to the one who's deathly allergic. It's chaos. Beautiful, perfectly dressed chaos. And yet, somehow, the ceremony finishes. Papers are signed, rice is thrown. Guests cheer with the intensity of people who aren't entirely sure what just happened but are happy it happened in the first place. The triple wedding has become a triptych of disorder, and the best is yet to come. The reception unfolds in a vast hall strung with bunting and lined with long tables, groaning under the weight of 3 wedding cakes, each decorated identically, of course. The same icing scrollwork, the same sugar lilies, the same small silver initials piped onto marzipan shields. Only the placement of the toppers differs, and even that begins to blur after the second sherry. A brass band strikes up a cheerful, if slightly confused, waltz as the guests drift in, chattering about the kiss incident. Someone already has a sketch of it. Yes, a pencil drawing hastily scribbled by a young cousin, showing the brides kissing the wrong grooms in comically exaggerated poses. It circulates down the table like a relic. Meanwhile, the bridal couples are trying to sort out their seating. Unfortunately, the place cards have also been mixed up. The calligrapher, flustered by late-night edits and a spilled bottle of ink, apparently scrambled the groom's names. So now groom 1 is seated next to bride 3's mother, and groom 2 is beside a plate labelled Clara, not that Clara. The guests think it's all part of the fun. You overhear an uncle whisper, "Well, at least it's not a quadruple wedding. Imagine the confusion if there'd been a cousin involved." He takes a large bite of pickled egg and winces with pride. When it comes time for the first dance, the band leader leans into the microphone and says, "If you're married and can hear this, please take your partner." Chaos. Bride 1 grabs groom 3. Groom 1 spins with a bridesmaid until someone taps his shoulder. Bride 2 begins waltzing with her own brother, who politely bows out once he realises. But again, no one is angry. This triple wedding, once meant to be a showpiece of social perfection, has become something far more precious. A joyful, sprawling comedy of errors. The kind of event people will tell stories about at future weddings, with a misty look in their eyes and the phrase, "You should have seen the moment." Later, the actual signed registers are reviewed, just to make sure the couples are legally correct. They are, miraculously. Though one bride did apparently sign her married name next to her sister's husband, and the vicar had to draw a small arrow in the margin and initial it. At twilight, when the brides gather on the steps for the bouquet toss, someone calls out, "Try not to throw it at the wrong groom." Everyone laughs. Even the fathers, stoic men in top hats who'd planned this whole thing like a military operation, now lean against the railing, smiling with the ease of defeat. You spot one of the grooms adjusting his boutonniere and muttering, "Well, at least I know I ended up with the right shoes." The bouquets are tossed, 3 of them. One hits a chandelier. You stand in the garden later, eating a sliver of cake with the wrong initials on it, and realise this wasn't just a wedding. It was a Victorian parable in motion, that the tighter you plan, the more delightfully the day might unravel. And sometimes the best way to know you've married the right person is realising you both laughed at the same mistake. You arrive at the wedding with no idea what to expect, except that the bride, everyone says, is quiet, not shy, not withdrawn, just silent. Famously so. There are stories, gilded and embroidered by gossip over tea trays, that she once went a whole garden party without saying a single word, that she communicates with eyebrow raises and carefully folded paper notes, that the only time she's ever truly spoken aloud was to accept this proposal. The groom, by contrast, is an orator, tall, confident, full of opinions about asparagus and architecture, and whether spats should return to formal wear. He smiles often and talks enough for 2, sometimes 3 people at once. When you see the couple together, they're oddly perfect. She nods in just the right places, tilts her head when he rambles, offers a gloved hand to pause him when needed. They've been seen walking the gardens in near silence, only the gravel underfoot speaking for them. It's a strange balance, but it works, and today apparently she will speak, just once. You find your seat in the sun-drenched conservatory, where rows of guests fan themselves with embroidered programmes. The ceremony begins with hushed reverence. The bride enters to a collective inhale, wearing a gown so delicately embroidered it looks like language itself, a script of silken flowers winding around her sleeves. Her veil is sheer, her face calm, not cold, just contained, like a painting hung in the exact right place. The vows proceed. The groom speaks first, eloquent and a touch emotional. You can see his hand tremble slightly as he slips the ring onto her finger. Then the vicar turns to her. "Do you, Miss Georgina Blythe, take this man?" The air tightens. A breeze from the high windows seems to hush even the sparrows outside. The bride lifts her chin and says, clear and firm, "I do." 2 words. That's it. And the room exhales. There is something weighty in it. Not just the sound, but the choice. You feel it ripple through the crowd. Those who've known her since childhood lean forward, wide-eyed. The maids peeking in from the hallway look at one another, mouths slightly open. And then, just as quietly, she nods, steps back, and never speaks again. Not that day, not that week, not even during the toasts. At the reception, the groom reads her thank you speech aloud, smiling when he stumbles on the flourishes she'd written in her own hand. She clinks her glass once for approval, twice to tease. The guests begin to speak of her gesture. That one, perfectly delivered phrase. How it must have taken days of consideration. How it meant more than all the other vows combined. You hear someone say, "She didn't just say I do, she meant it." And maybe she did. Maybe that's the point. As the reception unfolds, her silence becomes the centerpiece. People begin to notice how she commands attention without a single word, how guests lower their voices when she passes, how even the clatter of silverware softens slightly when she sits down, and she smiles, often, just not verbally. At the wedding breakfast, guests take turns attempting conversation with her. A reverend tries Latin jokes. A botanist offers a flower that supposedly only blooms when spoken to. She accepts each effort with grace, offering nods, eyebrow lifts, the faintest tilts of the head that somehow say more than entire sonnets. She communicates through gesture. A slight tap of her teacup means yes. A hand across her fan means perhaps not. She's fluent in eye contact, expressive in stillness. At one point, a young niece approaches with a napkin and pencil, asking for a written message. The bride writes carefully, deliberately. Speak less, listen more, and never waste your words. The note is passed from table to table, folded, copied, and, by dessert, quoted in a toast. The groom, glowing with pride, rises to respond. He begins, "I once feared I wouldn't understand her." Pause. "But now I know. She gives every word the weight of a bell in a silent room. When she speaks, the world pauses, and when she's quiet it listens harder." You glance over. She raises her glass to him, and in that moment the air shifts. People stop talking about her silence like it's something to pity or correct. They start treating it like a choice, a strength. The great Victorian paradox. In a world overflowing with etiquette manuals and overwrought speeches, this bride says only what matters, and says it better than anyone. Later, when the dancing begins, she joins in with the same quiet elegance. One hand on her husband's shoulder, the other lifting the hem of her gown just high enough to reveal embroidered slippers. She glides through the room like a melody you haven't heard but already know. And here's the strange thing. The more the guests drink, the louder they become, yet the more they watch her. They can't stop. She's still. She's serene. And she's unforgettable. Even the musicians, half drunk and rosy-cheeked, begin playing softer, slower. One fiddler says, "Feels wrong to drown her out." The others nod. The music shifts. Near the end of the night, a guest drunkenly stumbles toward her and asks, "Why won't you say more? Don't you have anything to tell us?" She smiles, takes a deep breath, and says softly, "I already did." 3 words, no more. The room falls silent, then erupts in applause, because in a world that demanded women fill the air with agreeable chatter, this bride carved space for herself through stillness and filled it with presence. and long after the cake has been boxed and the chairs folded away, people will remember this day not for the flowers or the lace or the speeches, but for the woman who spoke just 3 words and needed no more. You arrive just as the church bells toll 10, and there's a strange hush in the air. The guests are dressed and seated. The flowers, roses, peonies, and feverfew, are arranged in flawless spirals along the pews. The bride's veil has been laid out with near-sacred reverence. The organist's fingers rest on the keys, waiting and waiting. You glance at the programme. Processional at 10:15, vows at 10:30, cake by noon. It is now 10:45. The whispers begin in the 4th pew. Perhaps he's fixing a cufflink. He's probably rehearsing his vows. No, he's in the vestry. Someone saw him pacing. I heard he had a touch of the vapours. Well, someone says flatly, he'd better have the vapours and a note from a physician. Then a footman appears. He moves like a shadow, quiet, quick, clearly trying to avoid notice. But in a room like this, silence is a flare. He leans into the father of the bride, whispers something. The father stiffens. Slowly he stands and exits through the side door, his steps far too calm. The bride remains upstairs, out of sight. 10 more minutes pass. A cough echoes. A child drops a bonnet. The organist plays a slow, wandering tune to fill the space. Then the vicar stands, clears his throat. There appears to be a delay, he says carefully. Please make yourselves comfortable. And still, no one says it. No one dares. But you know, the groom is gone, not lost, not trapped beneath a horse, not detained by a misunderstanding about gloves and punctuality. Gone. And soon, a second truth unfurls like a gas lamp turned up too high. He's left with the florist, not the florist's daughter, not the delivery boy, the florist himself. You overhear it in pieces, half sentences slipping between teacups and lace gloves. They'd grown close over the last month. All those private consultations for arrangement decisions. He said he was checking rose quality every day. He left a note, no explanation, just a pressed anemone and the word freedom. The guests begin to shift from shock into something else. Not outrage. Not really. Curiosity. Some look amused. Others look genuinely moved. A few young women nod slowly as if privately understanding a courage they themselves might never possess. And then, just as the gossip reaches full boil, the bride enters, not weeping, not screaming, but with her shoulders squared and her veil removed. She walks down the aisle alone, takes her place in front of the vicar, and says calmly, "We may not have a wedding, but we will have cake, and we will dance." The congregation blinks, then cheers. Because frankly, what else is there to do? By the time the shock has worn off, tables are being moved, shoes kicked off, and parasols repurposed into decoration. The father of the bride, stone-faced and red-eared just minutes ago, is now uncorking the champagne with a level of commitment that suggests this might not be his first social surprise. And the bride? She changes, out of her gown, out of her gloves. She returns wearing a walking dress in bold navy blue, hair let down in a loose laughing braid. She's no longer the woman who was going to be wed that morning. She's now something else entirely. Host, heroine, an accidental legend. Someone adjusts the guest book, where it once said, "Witness to the union of..." It now reads, "Witness to the celebration of survival." The band, confused at first, picks up a tune, a faster one. No waltz, something with teeth, and before long guests are dancing, fast, unchoreographed, muddy in places. The vicar politely excuses himself before the polka begins. Over at the refreshment table, slices of untouched wedding cake are passed around without ceremony. The top tier is saved. No one knows quite why. Tradition, perhaps, or maybe just hope. A cousin suggests it be mailed to the runaways. This earns a slap on the wrist and a laugh. Someone starts a game of charades in the corner. Someone else uncorks a second bottle of port. And you find yourself seated beside the bride's grandmother, who is busy buttering a scone with militant precision. "She'll be fine," the old woman says without looking up. Better, in fact. You don't want to start a life with someone who tucks a note into a geranium and bolts. You nod and glance toward the bride, now spinning with a friend of the family in joyful barefoot rebellion. Her laugh rings louder than any toast could have hoped for. She's not performing, she's owning the moment. As twilight falls, someone lights lanterns, not for romance, but for continuation. Because this day will go on. Not in the way it was planned, but in a way that's truer to the bride than any scripted vow could have delivered. And perhaps that's what everyone here will remember. Not the missing groom, not the note, not even the whispered he left with the florist. They'll remember her. How she stood up, how she turned chaos into celebration, and how, in the absence of a promise from someone else, she kept a promise to herself to live, to dance, to eat the cake anyway. It's 2:30 when you step into the music hall, a grand old theatre with velvet curtains, gaslights flickering along gilded sconces, and a faint whiff of past performances still clinging to the floorboards. The usher hands you not a wedding programme, but a playbill. Front cover, one night only, the matrimonial debut of Mr. Lionel Wexley and Miss Dorothea Crane. Inside, cast list, running time, and a warning that late arrivals may not be seated until after the bouquet toss. You're not at a church, you're at a performance. The bride and groom, both stage actors of modest fame, have decided to merge their two great passions, matrimony and melodrama. Why choose between spotlight and vows when you can have both? The theatre fills with guests, some in lace gloves, some in opera cloaks, many looking slightly confused but delighted. A few of the older relations murmur about impropriety. A wedding is not a pantomime, one aunt whispers. It is when the groom used to be a pantomime horse, her nephew replies. The lights dim, the curtains rise, and there they are. The couple stands centre stage beneath a rose-strewn proscenium, with footlights casting a romantic glow that flatters even the stiffest corset. The set behind them is no altar. It's a hand-painted Victorian garden, complete with paper swans and a fake willow tree swaying slightly from an overhead draft. The officiant enters stage right. Yes, he enters, with a flourish. He's a real vicar, apparently. But he's also been cued by the stage manager, and there's a round of polite applause as he steps into his spotlight. "Dearly beloved," he begins, his voice echoing across the painted balconies. "We are gathered here today, in box seats and in stalls, to witness a most unusual and heartfelt union. The audience is enraptured. The vows are theatrical, of course. The groom proclaims his love with Shakespearean flair. 'I do thee wed, as constant as the moon upon yon painted scrim.' The bride responds with her own flourish, 'And I, with heart unmasked, do take thy name and thine rehearsal schedule.' The crowd laughs. Some weep. Someone tosses roses from the gallery. They exchange rings as the orchestra plays a gentle refrain, composed just for the occasion. The oboist gets a bit emotional and squeaks on the high note. No one minds, and when they kiss. A cue is fired backstage. The house lights blink twice. A mechanical dove flies briefly over the audience before crashing softly into the third row. The audience cheers, and the curtain falls. End of Act 1. As the curtain lands with a gentle thump, the audience, yourself included, erupts into applause. Not the polite wedding sort, but true theatrical clapping, rhythmic, enthusiastic, with the occasional foot stomp and a rogue "Bravo" shouted from the dress circle. Then the orchestra strikes up again, a quick-tempo waltz. The red curtains part once more and the newlyweds emerge, not in a carriage or down a marble staircase, but hand in hand, bowing centre stage like stars of a matinee revue. A voice from the wings announces, "Please remain seated for the reception." You blink. Did they mean intermission? No, they meant reception. The stage hands roll out a refreshment cart dressed like a Victorian tea trolley. Tiny cucumber sandwiches pirouette on doilies. Trays of petit fours are balanced with alarming precision on the rim of a prop fountain that's now bubbling with lemon punch. The wedding cake is wheeled in on a platform once used for Hamlet's grave. It's tiered, dramatic, and completely coated in gold leaf. The bride slices it using a theatrical sword borrowed from a production of Richard III. The audience gasps. She curtsies. You find your programme has a second page folded underneath labelled Act 2, Audience Participation. It begins with a round of impromptu toasts shouted from various seats. One by a fellow actor who declares, "May their love be less tragic than Othello, more stable than King Lear, and not nearly as long-winded as The Winter's Tale." The laughter is honest, warm. The bride raises her glass and mouths. No promises. A group of dancers then floods the stage, joined by the groomsmen, who have swapped their cravats for waist sashes and perform a routine choreographed earlier that morning. It's clumsy, joyful, and wildly off-tempo. The crowd adores it. Even the ushers begin distributing sweets to the front row. Caramels, mints, sugared violets, like it's a premiere night in full celebration. And then, as the evening wears on, the lights soften. A spotlight lands gently on the newlyweds seated stage left, their chairs drawn close together, her head resting on his shoulder. The noise fades. The orchestra stops. A hush falls, and the groom speaks one final line. No cue, no script. "We wrote this part ourselves." The audience claps once more, but softer now, and you realise this wasn't just novelty. It wasn't just theatre. This was them. Two people who made room for their whole selves in the most public of private moments, who shared their joy like a performance, not because they needed the attention, but because they knew the real magic of theatre is making strangers feel like family. As you file out through the ornate lobby, someone presses a souvenir playbill into your hand. You glance at the last page. "Thank you for attending the debut of Mr. and Mrs. Wexley. Encore to follow for the rest of their lives." And suddenly, the fourth wall between wedding and wonder feels a little less solid. By the time you reach this one, you're nearly weddinged out. Another cravat, another ribbon-tied invitation, another promise of cucumber sandwiches and predictable vows. But the moment you step into the great hall, you sense something's off. It's not the flowers, though they're strangely arranged in tea kettles. Not the music, though the pianist is clearly sight-reading everything with theatrical flair. It's the furniture. None of it matches. There's a chaise longue beside a church pew, a Queen Anne chair next to a milking stool. Someone is already seated on what appears to be a fainting couch balanced on books, and every item has a tag. Not a name card, a price. You blink. Are these for sale? Before you can ask, a tall man with an auctioneer's bell and, as it turns out, the bride's second cousin, climbs onto a stepladder and rings it crisply. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? Before we begin the soup course, we shall begin the bidding for the love seat from Aunt Winifred's parlour." The crowd titters. You're handed a paddle. You were expecting pudding, not paddle numbers. Turns out this is no accident. The couple, it seems, are moving abroad. An artistic pair, poets and typesetters, and rather than leave behind their beloved but mismatched estate, they've decided to sell it, piece by piece, during their own wedding feast. You glance around. The guest 2 seats over is seated on a mahogany corner bench going for £4 or best poem. Another woman fans herself with a bidding card marked Lot 19. Rococo bedside table, slightly haunted. And the bride, she's radiant. laughing freely, standing near a bureau now doubling as the cake table. She wears no veil, just a crown of dried herbs and string. Someone bids 3 shillings on the hat stand she arrived beside. The groom gives a toast, but it's not about love, it's about furniture. To the chair that squeaked beneath my grandfather, to the armoire that hid my sister for 2 summers, to the sideboard that held our first quarrel and our last apple tart. Guests raise their glasses. It is strangely moving. The auction proceeds. Some guests bid out of sentiment, others out of competition. One man fights heroically for a mismatched pair of dining chairs, only to lose them to a vicar who apparently collects orphaned pairs. Even the children are involved. One tiny girl holds up a sign for a rocking horse and is met with thunderous applause. Between courses, paddles rise like dandelions in the wind. You eat your soup while listening to people bicker over a grandfather clock that no longer ticks but looks excellent in candlelight. Every item has a story. Every sale, a small theatrical gasp or cheer. You ask the woman next to you why they're doing it this way. She shrugs. They figured why not let their home become part of everyone's memory? Let their past furnish someone else's future. It's oddly profound. And the more you look around, the more you realise this isn't just a wedding, it's a living estate sale, a moving poem, a final love letter to the objects that bore witness to everything that came before today. By the time the roast course arrives, served on a buffet table that's also up for bidding, the entire room is electric. Conversations shift from the bride's bouquet to sideboard provenance, from honeymoon guesses to, "Do you think I could get that footstool into a cab?" Each dish is served with a smile and in some cases a story. "This punch bowl once held marmalade for an entire winter," a bridesmaid announces, pouring ladlefuls into mismatched teacups. The ladle's newer, that's up for grabs too. The bride's father is stationed beside a credenza, taking silent bids with a twitch of his moustache. He's unexpectedly excellent at it. Flashing eyes, arched brow, an air of theatrical menace that turns the bidding war over a needlepoint ottoman into a social showdown. Meanwhile, the bride slips between tables with a notebook and a charcoal pencil, sketching who bought what. "I just want to remember where everything went," she says. "It's like giving away pieces of a diary." By now, half the chairs have been replaced with borrowed stools, crates, and in one case, a friend's lap. Guests don't mind. There's something liberating in the disorder. A maid of honour perches on a bread bin and declares it the most comfortable seat in the room. And the guests aren't just taking home furniture, they're taking home stories. One couple buys the clock, even though it hasn't worked in 20 years. "It'll start again when it's ready," the wife says, smiling. A widowed aunt wins the settee she courted her husband on, tears in her eyes as she touches the faded fabric. A group of cousins pool money to claim the mismatched cutlery, because nothing about this family ever matched anyway. The final item is the bride's writing desk. Carved oak, stained with ink, cluttered with notes, love letters, failed sonnets. The room hushes as she lifts the inkwell, revealing a ring-shaped stain. "He proposed right here," she says, her voice soft but sure. There's a moment's pause, then the groom stands, walks over, places a small tag on it. "Not for sale." The crowd exhales, applauds. The desk will go with them, to wherever they're headed next. As the evening fades and the hall grows dim, guests begin carrying their items to carts and cabs, laughing and balancing side tables like circus performers. The groom wheels out a small writing chair and someone calls, "Mind you don't sell yourself with it." The bride grins. He's off the market. And you finally step outside with a single candle holder tucked beneath your arm. Purchased perhaps for more than it's worth, but filled with a strange sort of warmth. Because in this wedding, nothing matched. Not the chairs, not the order, not even the stories told over port. And yet it all fit somehow. A marriage of movement, a feast of memories, a send-off not just for a couple, but for an entire past. And as the candles burn low and the piano plays the final notes of a borrowed waltz, you realise something. This was not just a wedding. It was a house unravelling with grace. You arrive at the wedding expecting the usual spectacle. Lace, lilies, and enough lace on lilies to make the queen blush. But what you find instead is a riot of colour-coded confusion. The first clue, the invitation, which had included an unusual postscript. Upon arrival, guests will receive their cake allocation. Dress accordingly. You thought it a joke. It was not. At the entrance to the hall, beneath garlands of sugar roses, a liveried attendant solemnly hands you a card bearing the words, "You're assigned lemon cardamom. Please wear shades of yellow, white, or gold. Citrus-themed accessories encouraged." You blink. You're wearing charcoal grey. The attendant frowns. You're ushered to the lemon cardamom section, an entire corner of the reception tent washed in pale yellow bunting, embroidered table runners, and centerpieces featuring tiny candied lemons. Around you, guests are wearing marigold sashes, canary silk gloves, even one gentleman in a waistcoat the colour of custard. Across the tent you see a swirl of pink, rosewater cake section. Beside it, a patch of brown and cream, treacle toffee guests. At the back, near a series of alarmingly wobbly trestle tables, a vibrant splash of green, pistachio pear delegation. The bride and groom, it seems, are obsessed with cake, not just serving it, but living it. Each guest was pre-assigned a cake flavour based on some mysterious algorithm, family bond, star chart compatibility, and spiritual density, a cousin explains over a lemon tart. You watch as guests try to figure out the significance of their flavour. One man in a mint waistcoat leans over and whispers, "I don't even like pistachio. What does it mean?" A rosewater guest replies, "It means you're here to support the floral energy of the day. Try not to be too bitter." No one's sure if she's joking. The bride enters, dressed not in white but in a gown of layered pastel tulle, the full spectrum of the cake menu. She resembles a glorious tiered confection herself, each layer a different shade of dessert. The groom wears a lapel of miniature spoons and a necktie patterned with icing flowers. A fondant boutonniere rests delicately on his jacket. His boots are piped in marzipan detail. You squint. They might actually be marzipan. When they make their grand speech, it's not about love or loyalty. It's about flavour unity. "We believe," says the bride, holding a miniature cake knife like a sceptre, "that the perfect wedding should be layered, like a gâteau, varied, sweet, a little absurd." The guests cheer. Or perhaps they just laugh nervously. It's unclear. Soon the cake itself is rolled in. It is enormous. Each layer represents a flavour, your flavour, 5 tiers, frosted within an inch of their lives. Guests flock toward the layer they've been assigned, holding up their place cards like boarding passes at a gate. And here's the twist. You may only dance after finishing your designated slice. The bride's rule. Someone groans. Someone else races toward their section with a fork. You nibble at your lemon cardamom portion and find it surprisingly excellent. Sharp, warm, and oddly empowering. By the time you step onto the dance floor, you're no longer a guest. You're a flavour ambassador. And this is just the beginning. The dance floor is a swirling spectacle of dessert-inspired mayhem. The rosewater guests waltz like they're floating through a spring garden. The treacle toffee group, all stomps and shoulder pops, as if channeling the boldness of their sticky slice. The pistachio pear delegates naturally try a waltz fused with Morris dancing, creative, nutty, slightly off-tempo. And your group, the lemon cardamoms, oh, you shine. You step into the rhythm with zest, literally. Someone throws a handful of lemon peel confetti into the air. a violinist begins a sharp, citrusy jig. You dance with a woman in golden gloves who smells faintly of bergamot. You feel as though your hips are being stirred by a pastry chef. And then comes the flavour battle. "Ladies and gentlemen," calls the groom from a raised platform, formerly the cake cart, "it's time for the bake-off waltz." What follows defies logic and physics. Each flavour section must perform a choreographed group routine, set to a classical piece chosen to match their assigned cake. Rosewater gets Debussy, treacle toffee gets a tuba-heavy polka, the lemon cardamoms are assigned a frenzied tarantella, and the prize, a golden whisk. You're not sure what it means, but your section wants it. Badly. The competition begins. You're swept into a frenzy of sugar-themed improvisation. One man mimes zesting a lemon with his coattails. A woman pirouettes while pretending to sift flour. Someone else, quite dramatically, whips egg whites by spinning in place until they collapse. The crowd erupts in laughter. But it's not all silliness, because between the absurdity, something magical happens. Strangers bond. The cake theme, the flavour assignment, it forces people together to dress up, to talk, to eat from the same tier, to dance like fools and cheer like cousins. Across the tent, the groom lifts the golden whisk above his head like a victorious general. "To the lemon cardamoms," he shouts. Wait, what? Your section has won. There's no trophy table, no speech, just a spontaneous group hug and a flurry of lemon-scented confetti. You're laughing, breathless, holding hands with someone whose name you never caught but whose footwork you'll remember forever. As the evening winds down, guests are gifted tiny tins containing a sliver of cake matching their original flavour. Each is labelled with a tiny poem. You came for cake, you stayed to dance, you left with joy, and icing on your pants. You shake the bride's hand as you leave. She smells faintly of vanilla and triumph. "Thank you," you whisper. She winks. You tasted lovely. Later, at home, you find yourself opening your little cake tin again, not to eat it, but to smell it. A quiet reminder that once upon a time you danced your way into someone else's story, assigned by flavour, and came out golden. The invitation promised elegance, tradition, and a journey through the 7 stages of courtship. You assumed it was poetic flourish. It was not. You arrive at the appointed time, 3 o'clock sharp, only to find yourself ushered into what appears to be a waiting salon. Velvet chairs, embroidered screens, and a handwritten sign resting on a music stand. Phase 1, the glance. Please remain seated until the first gown is revealed. You blink. Gown. A hush falls as soft harp music begins. Curtains part slightly at the far end of the room, revealing the bride for the first time. She's in gown 1, a pale blue muslin dress with delicate embroidery, meant to represent the early flirtation. Her hair is barely adorned, and she does not speak. She glides through the room once, then disappears. The guests applaud politely, some confused, some intrigued. You glance at your neighbour, who whispers, "I heard she studied theatre at Lady Margaret Hall, got very into symbolism." 5 minutes later, a bell rings. A footman enters with a scroll. Phase 2, the letter. Intermission for tea and mild speculation. You sip your tea and try to guess the next dress. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, gown 2. Now she wears pale ivory, with gloved hands holding a satin envelope. Her hair is twisted higher, her expression more determined. Still, no words. It becomes clear that each gown represents a romantic stage, and each stage must be viewed, reflected upon, and discussed, as if you were part of a living gallery installation, and the bride is the canvas. Gown 3 is velvet, deep burgundy, to signify passion. Gown 4 is storm grey taffeta, paired with dramatic earrings and a downturned gaze. Conflict. Guests begin keeping notes. A group of elderly women near the punch bowl begins scoring each dress on execution and emotional believability. I thought the hemline on the argument dress was a touch aggressive, one mutters. You find yourself increasingly engaged. Gown 5, white with yellow accents, represents resolution. The bride appears carrying a single daisy. She places it in a vase and walks away. You realise you've stopped checking your watch, because somehow she's made you feel like a part of her emotional journey, without saying a word, and there are still 2 dresses to go. By the time Gown 6 arrives, the room has fallen into reverent silence. Gone is the playful whispering or polite clapping. Guests sit as if in a theatre, postures straight, expressions hushed, watching a woman slowly descend a curved staircase in a shimmering gown of pale silver. This one is titled Devotion. The bride's hair is now fully up, crowned with a delicate filigree comb that glints in the gaslight. Her movements are slow, deliberate. One gloved hand skims the railing, the other holds nothing. No bouquet, no letter, no gesture. She walks the length of the room, pausing only once, to meet the groom's eyes across the floor. He hasn't moved this entire time. He's been watching her through every dress, every stage, and in this moment something changes between them. It feels less like a fashion show and more like a vow. There is no applause when she exits, just stillness. And then, at long last, comes Gown 7, the final dress, the wedding dress. You expect white, ivory, something grand. But what steps into the room is simpler, quieter. A cream-coloured silk gown with no adornment, no frills, no veil. Instead of fanfare, the bride walks straight to the centre of the room and says her first words of the entire day, "You've waited long enough." The guests laugh, not because it's funny, but because it breaks the spell. She smiles at the groom, who approaches with equal calm. They meet in the centre, take each other's hands, and recite their vows with no priest, no officiant, no script. Just 2 people speaking softly into a room that has become utterly theirs. Then, at last, a single bell rings, and the true celebration begins. Musicians strike up a bright, tumbling reel. Trays of wine and sugared violets emerge from nowhere. The bride changes one final time into a loosely pinned-up version of Gown 7, paired with dancing shoes and a laugh that hasn't stopped since. You catch her at one point near the refreshments. "Why 7 dresses?" you ask. She shrugs. "Because falling in love doesn't happen all at once. I thought I'd wear the whole story." And that's exactly what she did. Later that night, when you're home and peeling off your own, singular, admittedly boring outfit, you think about what it would be like to dress for every version of yourself, for every chapter, every change, every turn of the heart. It's strange how a wedding can make you consider your own love story, even if it's still being written. It's already an odd wedding when you realise that every guest has been assigned a prop. Not a party favour, a prop, like in a stage play. You walk in and are handed a small brass bell tied with ribbon. The usher, dressed like a stagehand, says only, "You'll know when to ring it." You turn, bewildered, and spot a woman clutching a feathered fan. A man walks by holding a velvet pillow with no apparent purpose. Someone near the back wears a sash labelled Act 3. The entire wedding is a scripted performance, literally. Each guest received, days earlier, a sealed envelope containing their role. Some were readers, some were background atmosphere. You, lucky you, were in the bell choir. You didn't take it seriously at the time. Now you're beginning to worry. The ceremony starts precisely at 4 p.m, introduced by a booming voice from nowhere. Act I. The introduction of characters. The groom enters to plight applause. He waves awkwardly. The bride follows, but not down the aisle. Instead, she bursts through a side curtain, fanning herself dramatically with a script and sighing, "My cue is early again." Laughter ripples through the room. This is not just a wedding. It is a full-blown Victorian theatrical wedding, a style popular among certain creative households in the 1870s, when amateur dramatics were all the rage and marriages became an excuse to stage elaborate productions in drawing rooms, gardens, or rented theatres. You notice that everything around you, lighting, seating, even the food trays, has been arranged like a set. Painted scenery lines the back wall. The chaplain appears to be an actor. A dog barks and someone from the audience shouts, "That's not in the script." The groom responds without missing a beat. Then cut to intermission. Someone actually dims the lights. You're halfway between delighted and deeply confused, and then the curtain rises. Yes, an actual curtain. Act 2. The Great Misunderstanding. It's a short play. The bride pretends to change her mind. The groom begs with Shakespearean flair. A bridesmaid faints into a chaise longue with a fan to the forehead. The crowd roars. At some point, someone behind you strikes a triangle. You instinctively ring your brass bell. It's the right moment. The bride pauses, turns toward the sound and says, "Ah, the signal." We proceed. You're in it now, and the show must go on. By the time Act 3, the reconciliation begins, you've stopped trying to understand what's real and what's staged. The groom kneels dramatically beneath a papier-mâché arch labelled Destiny. The bride, holding a velvet script like a holy book, recites a monologue about the chaos of love and the inevitability of fate. Her voice trembles, whether from emotion or theatrical training you're not sure, but she gets a standing ovation. Then comes the most peculiar moment yet. The best man steps forward, clears his throat and says solemnly, "It is time for the audience to vote." Vote? Ushers pass out small fans, pink on one side, blue on the other. You're instructed to hold up pink if you believe the bride should forgive the groom. Blue if you think she ought to run away and take the scenic route through Tuscany. It's absurd. It's delightful. The fans go up, a sea of pink, a few blues, mostly from children. The bride surveys the room, then fans herself with her own pink vote and says, "Very well, he may rise." The groom leaps to his feet, a rose clenched between his teeth. You're crying now. From laughter, from joy, from confusion. It all blurs into a single, sticky sweet Victorian cocktail of camp and sincerity. The curtain falls, then rises again. Act 4. The actual vows. No longer in character, the couple now turns to each other, not as actors, not as comic archetypes, but simply as two people who've spent weeks planning something truly ridiculous and are now more in love because of it. Their vows are short, honest, unrehearsed, and that's the twist. The pageantry was the shell, but this is the yolk. They slip rings onto each other's fingers, laugh when they stumble, and seal it with a kiss. After one last pause so the maid of honour can call out, "And scene." The reception is no less theatrical. Guests are encouraged to remain in character, whatever that means for your role. You share a table with a woman still clutching her Act 2 umbrella of despair, and a man whose only job was to sigh at key moments. Everyone gets a personalised programme to take home. Your name is listed under Supporting Ensemble Bell Choir Division. You feel oddly proud. Before you leave, the bride hands you a rose. It's plastic, painted gold with a tiny tag. "Thank you for playing your part." You drive home humming the overture they played during the cake cutting, and you realise something. Maybe the strangest weddings are the ones that feel the most like life itself. Messy, scripted, spontaneous, a little over the top, and entirely unforgettable. It begins with a boat. Not a metaphorical one. A real, 20-foot mahogany-decked rowboat perched delicately on a velvet platform in the middle of the drawing room. You stare at it. Everyone does. Because the invitation said, "Please wear nautical attire. We shall be married upon the shores of our imagination." And clearly they meant it. This is the SS Matrimony, a symbolic vessel built by the bride's cousin, an amateur shipwright and committed romantic. Around the room, the wallpaper is painted with waves. Paper gulls dangle from the ceiling. There's even a faint scent of sea salt in the air, thanks to someone cleverly burning dried kelp near the windows. The bride and groom met at a rowing club, you're told. But that's not really the point. The point is, they wanted to mark the beginning of their marriage with a voyage of the mind, and they were going to take everyone with them. You're handed a map. Not of the venue, but of the itinerary. It includes stops like Island of First Glances, Shoals of Doubt, Storm of Arguments, Brief, Safe Harbour of Reconciliation, Port of Matrimonial Bliss, and apparently each stage will be performed as part of the ceremony. The guests are seated in concentric semicircles around the shore. The officiant, dressed as an admiral, steps forward, salutes the crowd and begins, "Dear passengers, we welcome you aboard this most peculiar vessel. Please ensure your hearts are fully upright and in the locked position." There is a bell, a splash, sound effect, a puff of steam from behind the curtain, and then, from the hallway, the bride rows in. Yes, rows. She's in a custom white gown with a reinforced hem, sitting backwards in a two-man boat being wheeled along by hidden pulleys. She rows slowly, deliberately toward the centre, where the groom waits, also in full sailor regalia, holding a spyglass and grinning like a man about to marry both his fiancée and the entire idea of whimsy itself. As the bride's rowboat entrance concludes with a gentle bump against a velvet dock, the groom extends a hand and helps her step ashore. She laughs. Not the dainty kind, but a full, giddy laugh. The sort you'd expect from someone who just navigated a wedding aisle shaped like an ocean current. The Admiral Officiant consults a weathered scroll. "We now disembark at the Island of First Glances," he proclaims. "Here our voyagers will recall the first time they saw one another." And they do. Right there in front of you, the bride and groom take turns telling the room how they met. Not in some tempest of fate, but on a muddy dock, arguing over whose oars had been mistakenly taken. The story is humble, sweet, ridiculous, just like this entire afternoon. The journey continues. They reenact the storm of arguments by each tossing a small cloth anchor into the symbolic sea, naming one thing they've fought about. He says laundry. She says talking during books. The guests nod. The sea forgives. At the safe harbour of reconciliation, they offer each other small items. He gives her a hand-drawn compass. She gives him a miniature flask with the word patience engraved. Then finally, they arrive at the port of matrimonial bliss. This is the part where the Admiral removes his hat, bows, and speaks not as a character, but as a dear friend. His voice softens, the theatre fades. What's left is the vow, a simple, unadorned promise to weather life's ocean together. They exchange rings tied to tiny buoys. When they kiss, the crowd doesn't erupt. It exhales, one long, joyful breath like a breeze over still waters. At the reception, guests drink cocktails with names like Maiden Voyage and Captain's Regret. They dance beneath nets strung with fairy lights. The wedding cake is shaped like a lighthouse, and as you head home, sea-themed party favour in hand, you glance back one last time at the SS Matrimony. Still there, gently lit, a symbol of a love strange enough to sail beyond convention, and charming enough to take a whole room with it. Now that the last dance has played, and the velvet sails are lowered, you tuck yourself under the covers, still smiling at the memory of floating boats, stage lights, brass bells, and brides who wore their entire emotional arc in 7 gowns. It's strange, isn't it? The way people in the Victorian era, prim, laced up, rigid, found such wildly creative ways to express love. They turned weddings into plays, puzzles, paintings, voyages, and metaphors. They courted each other with teacups, telegrams, and tango routines, and somehow it all made perfect sense. Because when you think about it, a wedding isn't just an event, it's a stage, a canvas, a ship, a spectacle, a joke and a promise, all stitched into the same satin hem. You picture the rowboat once more, docked in the middle of a crowded room, candlelight flickering off the water-painted walls. You hear the faint clink of a prop bell. You remember the moment when someone stood up in a corset or a sailor's cap and said, "I love you enough to make it weird." And you think, maybe that's the most romantic thing of all. So go ahead, close your eyes, let the curtain fall. The orchestra's quiet now, but the story sails on.